Welcome. Tonight, we are going to talk about the Trojan War, one of the most enduring stories ever told, a tale that has captivated humanity for more than 3,000 years. We will explore not just the magnificent epic that Homer gave us, but also the archaeological evidence, the historical context, and the profound mystery of how much truth might lie beneath layers of poetry and legend. This is a story that exists in the fascinating borderland between myth and history, between the Bronze Age world that actually existed and the heroic age that poets imagined. So find a comfortable position, perhaps dim the lights if you wish, and let us journey together back to a time when great citadels crowned the hills of Greece and Anatolia, when bronze weapons gleamed in the Mediterranean sun, when ships with painted eyes crossed the wine-dark sea, and when the fate of kingdoms could turn on the choices of gods and heroes. The world of bronze. To understand the Trojan War, we must first understand the world in which it may have taken place. This was the late Bronze Age, roughly 1600 to 1100 BCE, a time very different from our own, yet one that laid foundations for Western civilization. The Eastern Mediterranean was a cosmopolitan world, connected by trade routes that stretched from Mesopotamia to Egypt, from Anatolia to Cyprus and Crete. In Greece, this was the time of the Mycenaean civilization, named after Mycenae, the golden city of Agamemnon. The Mycenaeans were warriors and traders, builders of massive citadels with walls so huge that later Greeks believed they must have been constructed by giants called cyclopes. These fortress palaces crowned hills throughout Greece, at Mycenae itself, at Tiryns, at Pylos, at Thebes and elsewhere. They were administrative centers, religious sanctuaries, and military strongholds all at once. The Mycenaeans had inherited much from the Minoan civilization of Crete, which had flourished before them. They adopted Minoan art styles, architectural techniques, and religious practices, transforming them into something distinctly their own. But while the Minoans had been primarily maritime traders who built unfortified palaces, the Mycenaeans were more warlike. Their citadels had massive defensive walls. Their art celebrated warfare and hunting, and their society was organized around a warrior aristocracy. We know something of their world from the clay tablets they left behind, written in a script called Linear B that was brilliantly deciphered in the 1950s by Michael Ventris. These tablets reveal a complex bureaucratic society that kept meticulous records of everything: inventories of bronze weapons and chariot wheels, rations for workers, offerings to gods, lists of spices and livestock. The tablets mention many of the gods who would appear in Homer's epics: Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Athena, Artemis, Dionysus. The religious continuity between the Bronze Age and classical Greece is remarkable. Across the Aegean Sea, in what is now Turkey, lay Anatolia, home to various peoples and kingdoms. The greatest power was the Hittite Empire, based far to the east in what is now central Turkey. The Hittites kept extensive written records in cuneiform script on clay tablets, and these archives mention many peoples and places in western Anatolia. They speak of a land they called Wilusa and a city called Tarouissa, names that scholars believe may correspond to Ilios, another name for Troy, and Troia itself. The western coast of Anatolia was a patchwork of smaller kingdoms and city-states, many maintaining complex relationships with the Hittite Empire to the east and the Mycenaean kingdoms across the sea to the west. This was a world of diplomatic marriages, trade agreements, territorial disputes, and occasional warfare. It was a Bronze Age world where tin and copper, the ingredients of bronze, were precious commodities, where literacy was the province of specialized scribes, where kings ruled from fortified citadels, and where religion permeated every aspect of life. Into this historical framework, we must place the city that the Greeks called Troy, the Hittites may have called Wilusa, and which sat on a strategic hill overlooking the Dardanelles, the narrow strait connecting the Aegean Sea to the Sea of Marmara, and ultimately to the Black Sea. This location was no accident. Any ships sailing between these seas had to pass through this strait, and the prevailing winds often forced vessels to wait for favourable conditions. Troy's position allowed it to control and profit from this maritime traffic, as well as from overland trade routes. This, then, was the real world of the Bronze Age, the historical stage upon which the drama of the Trojan War might have been played out, if indeed such a conflict occurred. But the story we have received through the mists of time is far more than a simple historical chronicle. It is an epic of such power and beauty that it has never ceased to move human hearts. The Seeds of War, the story of the Trojan War, as the Greeks told it, actually begins long before the first ship set sail for Troy. It begins, as so many Greek myths do, with a wedding, specifically the wedding of the sea nymph Thetis to the mortal hero Peleus. All the gods were invited to this celebration except one, Eris, the goddess of discord and strife. Angry at her exclusion, Eris decided to sow chaos among the divine guests. She appeared at the feast and tossed among the assembled gods a golden apple inscribed with the words, "For the fairest." Immediately, 3 goddesses claimed it. Hera, queen of the gods, Athena, goddess of wisdom and warfare, and Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty. Each believed herself most deserving of the title fairest. The gods, including Zeus himself, wisely refused to judge between the 3 goddesses. Instead, they appointed a mortal to make this impossible choice, a young Trojan prince named Paris, who was living as a shepherd on Mount Ida, tending flocks far from the city of Troy. Paris had been abandoned there as an infant because of a prophecy that he would bring destruction to his city, but he had survived and grown into a beautiful young man. The 3 goddesses appeared before Paris on Mount Ida, each offering him a bribe to win his vote. Hera promised him power. She would make him ruler of all Europe and Asia. Athena offered wisdom and skill in war. She would make him the greatest warrior who ever lived, victorious in every battle. But Aphrodite's offer was different. She promised him the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris chose Aphrodite. He awarded her the golden apple, and in that moment, the fate of Troy was sealed. For the most beautiful woman in the world was Helen, and she was already married to Menelaus, king of Sparta. Now we must speak of Helen, whose face would launch 1,000 ships, whose beauty would bring kingdoms to ruin. Helen was no ordinary mortal woman. She was the daughter of Zeus himself, born when the king of gods came to the mortal woman Leda in the form of a swan. Helen's beauty was literally divine, so extraordinary that when she came of age, virtually every eligible prince and king in Greece sought her hand in marriage. Her earthly father, King Tyndareus of Sparta, found himself in an impossible position. Whomever he chose to marry Helen, he would offend all the other suitors, potentially causing war. But the cunning Odysseus, prince of Ithaca, suggested a solution. All the suitors should swear an oath to accept Tyndareus's choice and to defend the chosen husband's right to Helen if anyone should try to abduct her or challenge the marriage. The suitors agreed, and this oath would eventually bring all the Greek kingdoms into the Trojan War. Tyndareus chose Menelaus, brother of the powerful Agamemnon, king of Mycenae. Helen went to Sparta as Menelaus's bride, and for a time all was well. She bore Menelaus a daughter named Hermione and lived as queen in one of Greece's most powerful kingdoms. But Aphrodite had not forgotten her promise to Paris. The goddess guided the Trojan prince to Sparta, where he was received with the sacred hospitality that Greek culture demanded. Menelaus welcomed this foreign prince into his palace, fed him at his table, gave him gifts. And then Menelaus made a fateful decision. He sailed to Crete to attend a funeral, leaving Helen to entertain their guest. What happened next has been told countless ways over the millennia. Did Paris seduce Helen, using Aphrodite's divine charm? Did he abduct her by force? Or did Helen go willingly, choosing love over duty? The ancient sources differ. Some say Helen was an innocent victim, spirited away against her will. Others say she fell deeply in love with Paris and chose to abandon her husband and daughter. Still others suggest she was under a divine spell, her will not entirely her own. Whatever the truth, when Menelaus returned from Crete, his wife and guest were gone. They had sailed to Troy, taking with them much of Sparta's treasure. The violation of sacred hospitality, the theft, and above all the abduction or seduction of his wife could not stand. Menelaus's honor demanded action, and his brother Agamemnon, the most powerful king in Greece, agreed to help him. The gathering of heroes Agamemnon sent messengers throughout Greece, calling upon all those who had sworn the oath to Tyndareus. The kings and princes of Greece were to gather their forces and sail to Troy to retrieve Helen and punish the Trojans for the insult they had given to Greek honor. This was to be the greatest military expedition the ancient world had ever seen. But not everyone was eager to honor their oath. Take Odysseus, king of Ithaca, whose cunning had devised the oath in the first place. Odysseus had recently married Penelope and fathered a son, Telemachus. An oracle had warned him that if he went to Troy, he would not return home for 20 years. So when Agamemnon's messengers arrived in Ithaca, Odysseus pretended to be mad. They found him ploughing a field, sowing salt instead of seed, acting as though his mind had gone. But Palamedes, one of the Greek leaders, suspected deception. He placed infant Telemachus in front of Odysseus's plough. Immediately, Odysseus stopped, turning the plough aside to avoid harming his son. His sanity thus proven, he had no choice but to join the expedition. Odysseus never forgave Palamedes for this, and the anger would later have tragic consequences. Another reluctant hero was Achilles, the son whom Thetis had borne to Peleus, the very couple whose wedding had sparked this chain of events. Thetis knew a prophecy about her son. He could choose a long, peaceful life in obscurity, or a short, glorious life as the greatest warrior of his generation. She knew which choice her son would make once war called to him, and she desperately wanted to spare him. So Thetis hid Achilles among the daughters of King Lycomedes of Skyros, disguising him as a girl. But Odysseus, tasked with finding Achilles because another prophecy stated that Troy could not fall without him, used cunning once more. He came to Lycomedes' palace as a merchant, displaying beautiful jewelry and fine cloth that would appeal to young women, but also including among his wares a magnificent sword and shield. When Odysseus arranged for a false alarm of attack to sound, all the genuine girls scattered in fear, but Achilles instinctively grabbed the weapons, revealing himself. His disguise penetrated, Achilles joined the expedition, bringing with him his dearest companion, Patroclus, and his legendary armor forged by the god Hephaestus himself. His fate was sealed. Other great heroes answered the call. There was Ajax, son of Telamon, second only to Achilles in martial prowess, a giant of a man whose shield was like a city wall. There was Diomedes, king of Argos, fierce in battle and favoured by Athena. There was Nestor, the aged king of Pylos, whose wisdom was valued as much as any warrior's strength. There was the physician Machaon and his brother Podalirius, sons of the healing god Asclepius. There was Idomeneus, king of Crete, leading a large contingent from his wealthy island kingdom. And there was Agamemnon himself, king of Mycenae and overlord of much of Greece, who would lead this vast coalition. Agamemnon was a powerful, proud man, a competent military commander, but also arrogant and quick to anger, qualities that would cause problems once the expedition began. The Greek forces gathered at the port of Aulis in Boeotia. Homer tells us that 1,000 ships assembled there, though this number is likely poetic exaggeration. Still, it must have been a formidable fleet, carrying thousands of warriors, support personnel, supplies, and weapons. The ships were drawn up on the beach, their curved hulls painted in bright colours, their single square sails furled, waiting for the wind. But the wind would not come. Day after day, the fleet sat becalmed at Aulis. The seer Calchas explained that the goddess Artemis was angry with Agamemnon. Different versions of the myth give different reasons for her anger. Perhaps Agamemnon had killed one of her sacred deer, or boasted of being a better hunter than the goddess herself. Whatever the cause, Artemis demanded a terrible price for favourable winds. Agamemnon must sacrifice his own daughter, Iphigenia. This is one of the darkest moments in the entire saga. Agamemnon, faced with the choice between his daughter and his war, chose the war. He sent a message to his wife Clytemnestra telling her to send Iphigenia to Aulis under the pretext that she was to marry Achilles. When the girl arrived, full of joy at her impending marriage, she learned instead that she was to be the sacrifice. Different versions tell what happened next in different ways. In some, Iphigenia was actually killed on the altar, a tragic victim of her father's ambition and the gods' cruel games. In others, Artemis took pity at the last moment and substituted a deer, spiriting Iphigenia away to serve as her priestess in far-off Tauris. But either way, the psychological truth remains. Agamemnon chose war and glory over his own child. Clytemnestra would never forgive him, and this act would plant seeds of vengeance that would eventually destroy the house of Atreus. The winds came. The fleet set sail, 1,000 ships with painted prows crossing the blue Aegean, carrying the warriors of Greece toward their destiny at Troy. The city of Priam. As the Greek fleet approached the Troad, the region around Troy, let us turn our attention to the city they came to attack. Troy, or Ilios as it was also called, sat on its strategic hill, the citadel of King Priam and Queen Hecuba, a wealthy and powerful city that had stood for generations. Troy's legendary founder was Ilus, grandson of Dardanus, who had first settled the region. The gods themselves had helped build Troy's walls. According to the myth, Apollo and Poseidon had served King Laomedon, Priam's father, building the city's magnificent fortifications. But Laomedon had cheated the gods of their promised payment, an act of hubris that would have consequences for his descendants. The hero Heracles had later sacked the city because of another of Laomedon's broken promises, killing the king and all his sons except one, young Priam, who survived to rebuild Troy and rule it to greater glory than ever before. Under Priam's long reign, Troy prospered. The city controlled trade through the Dardanelles, exacting tolls from ships and profiting from the forced layovers when adverse winds kept vessels in harbour. Troy's wealth was legendary. When Homer describes Priam's palace, he speaks of 50 bedchambers for the king's sons and their wives, and 12 for his daughters and their husbands. This is poetic exaggeration, certainly, but it speaks to a conception of Troy as a large, wealthy, powerful city. Priam and Hecuba had many children. Tradition says 50 sons and 50 daughters, though again, this is likely symbolic rather than literal. The most important of these were Hector, the eldest son and greatest of Troy's warriors; Paris, whose actions had brought the Greek fleet to their shores; Deiphobus, another skilled warrior; Helenus, who had the gift of prophecy; Cassandra, cursed to speak true prophecies that no one would believe; Polyxena, the beautiful daughter, and many others. Hector was everything Paris was not. Where Paris was beautiful, Hector was noble. Where Paris was a lover, Hector was a warrior. Where Paris had shirked his responsibilities by living as a shepherd, Hector had embraced his role as Troy's protector and future king. Hector was married to Andromache, daughter of a king from nearby Cilicia, and they had a young son named Astyanax. Hector loved his city, his family, his duty, and he knew from the first appearance of the Greek fleet that this war his brother had caused would bring doom to all he held dear. But Hector's sense of honor and family loyalty left him no choice. Paris was his brother, and Helen was now under Troy's protection. Whatever the rights or wrongs of how she came to be there, Troy's honor now demanded that they keep her. To surrender Helen would be to show weakness, to invite future attacks and challenges. So Hector prepared to defend his city, though he understood the cost would be terrible. Paris himself seems to have been more ambivalent. The sources portray him as brave enough in battle. He was a skilled archer, but also as someone more interested in love and beauty than in war and glory. He was devoted to Helen and she to him in most versions, but he seems to have understood that he had brought catastrophe to his people. He was beautiful, charming, but also perhaps weak in ways that his brother never was. Helen herself occupied a strange position in Troy. She was the cause of the war, yet also a victim of divine machinations. Some Trojans resented her presence, blaming her for the coming violence. Others pitied her. She seems to have been treated honorably by Priam and Hecuba, who recognized that she was as much a pawn of the gods as anyone. But she lived with guilt and shame, knowing that thousands would die because of her. Troy had allies throughout the region. From Thrace in the north came Rhesus with his magnificent white horses. From Lycia in the south came the warriors Sarpedon and Glaucus. From Paeonia came Pyraechmes. From the Troad itself came various contingents. The Trojans and their allies were numerous and skilled in war, but they knew they faced the combined might of Greece, and the outcome was far from certain. The war, when it came, would be unlike the swift raids and battles that characterized most Bronze Age conflicts. This would be a siege, a long, grinding war of attrition, lasting years, draining both sides of their strength and will. And it would be a war in which gods and mortals alike would play their parts, in which honor and pride would drive men to extraordinary deeds and terrible choices. The first 9 years. The war did not begin well for either side. The Greeks landed not directly at Troy but in nearby Mysia, mistaking it for the Troad in their initial approach. The Mysians, led by their king Telephus, drove the invaders back to their ships, wounding many, including the great Achilles. Telephus himself was wounded by Achilles' spear, and the wound would not heal. An oracle told him that only the one who inflicted the wound could cure it. So Telephus eventually came to the Greeks and guided them to Troy in exchange for healing. Once properly arrived at Troy, the Greeks drew their ships up on the beach and established their camp, a city of tents and makeshift structures that would be their home for the next 9 years. The topography was crucial. The plain of Troy stretched between the city on its hill and the Hellespont, the Dardanelles, with the rivers Scamander and Simois flowing through it. The Greeks could not entirely cut Troy off from support and supplies, for the city had allies who could reach it by land routes the Greeks could not fully control. The war settled into a pattern. The Greeks could not successfully storm Troy's walls, but the Trojans could not drive the Greeks from their beachhead. So the conflict became a series of raids, skirmishes, and occasional larger battles. The Greeks raided the surrounding countryside and coastal cities, seeking both supplies and to cut off Troy's allies and trade partners. The Trojans would sortie from their city to challenge the Greeks or to protect their territory. These 9 years are largely passed over in Homer's Iliad, which focuses on events in the 10th year. But other sources and references within Homer give us glimpses of what occurred. Achilles, the greatest of the Greek warriors, led many of these raids. He sacked 12 cities on the coast and 11 inland, accumulating vast plunder and numerous captives. It was in one of these raids that he captured Briseis, a woman who would become central to the crisis that drives the Iliad's plot. The war took its toll on both sides. Men died in skirmishes and battles. Resources dwindled. The Greeks, far from home, must have suffered from disease, especially in the hot summers when the water quality would deteriorate. The Trojans, protected by their walls but essentially under siege, had to carefully manage their supplies and maintain the loyalty of their increasingly strained allies. During these years, several events occurred that would be important later. Palamedes, who had exposed Odysseus's feigned madness, was killed, murdered, some sources say, in revenge by Odysseus. The seer Calchas made various prophecies about what would be necessary for Greek victory, creating a sense that fate itself was involved in the war's outcome. Various heroes performed notable deeds, building reputations that would be celebrated in the war's eventual telling. But as the 10th year of the war began, the situation remained essentially stalemated. Troy stood unbroken, but the Greek army remained encamped and dangerous. Both sides were weary, but neither would yield. It would take a crisis to break this deadlock, a crisis that would nearly destroy the Greek coalition from within before leading, eventually, to Troy's fall. And that crisis began, as so many disasters do, with wounded pride and a refusal to compromise. The Wrath of Achilles. The Iliad, Homer's great epic, does not tell the entire story of the Trojan War. It covers only a few weeks in the 10th year of the conflict, focusing on a single theme announced in its very first word, menin, wrath. Specifically, the wrath of Achilles, which nearly doomed the Greek cause and cost countless lives. The crisis began with a raid. Achilles had captured 2 women in one of his attacks on cities near Troy, Chryseis, daughter of a priest of Apollo, and Briseis, who became Achilles' concubine and, perhaps more, some sources suggest genuine affection between them. Chryseis was awarded to Agamemnon as his war prize, while Briseis went to Achilles. But Chryseis' father, Chryses, came to the Greek camp to ransom his daughter. He brought generous gifts and pleaded with Agamemnon to accept the ransom and return Chryseis. Agamemnon, displaying the arrogance and inflexibility that characterized his leadership, refused harshly, sending the old priest away with threats and insults. Chryses, in his anguish, prayed to Apollo, whose priest he was, and Apollo heard him. The god descended from Olympus in fury and sent a plague upon the Greek army. For 9 days, funeral pyres burned continuously as men sickened and died. Finally, Achilles called an assembly to discuss the crisis. The seer Calchas, after being promised protection by Achilles, revealed the truth. Apollo was punishing the Greeks for Agamemnon's treatment of his priest. The only solution was to return Chryseis without ransom and make a hecatomb, a sacrifice of 100 cattle, to appease the god. Agamemnon had no choice but to agree, but his pride was wounded. If he must give up his prize, he declared, he would take another man's as compensation. And he chose to take Briseis from Achilles. This was not merely about a woman, though Achilles may well have cared for Briseis. It was about honor, about time, the respect and recognition a hero was due. In the warrior culture of the Bronze Age, a man's worth was measured by his prowess in battle and the honors that came with it. War prizes were symbols of that worth. By taking Briseis, Agamemnon was not just depriving Achilles of a concubine, he was publicly diminishing him, treating him as subordinate rather than as the supreme warrior who had won more battles and taken more prizes than anyone. Achilles exploded in rage. He nearly drew his sword to kill Agamemnon then and there, prevented only by the goddess Athena's direct intervention. Instead, he announced that he would withdraw from the fighting. He would remain in the camp, he was bound by oath to the expedition, but he would no longer fight for Agamemnon or the Greek cause. And without Achilles, the greatest warrior in either army, the Greeks would soon learn how much they needed him. Achilles withdrew to his tent, and with him withdrew his contingent of Myrmidons, the fierce warriors from Phthia who followed him. He spent his time in his shelter, singing songs and playing the lyre, while his beloved companion Patroclus tended to him. He called upon his mother, the sea goddess Thetis, and begged her to intercede with Zeus. "Let Zeus give victory to the Trojans," Achilles asked, until the Greeks recognized how much they needed him and gave him the honor he deserved. Thetis went to Zeus on Mount Olympus, and the king of gods, who owed her a debt from ages past, agreed. He would tilt the tide of battle in Troy's favor, at least for a time, regardless of how the other gods might feel about it. The tide turns. With Zeus's will committed to Trojan success and Achilles refusing to fight, the nature of the war changed. Agamemnon, trying to prove he didn't need Achilles, led the Greek army onto the field in a major battle. But without their greatest champion, and with Zeus's favor turned against them, the Greeks found themselves hard-pressed. Hector, Troy's greatest warrior, came fully into his own in these battles. Homer's portrait of Hector is magnificent. He is the perfect counterpoint to Achilles. Where Achilles fights for glory and personal honor, Hector fights for duty and to protect his city. Where Achilles is semi-divine and nearly invincible, Hector is entirely human, knowing he will likely die but fighting anyway. Where Achilles can indulge in rage and withdrawal, Hector must stay on the field because he is his, people's only real hope. One of the most touching moments in all of literature occurs during this period. Homer shows us Hector returning to Troy during a break in the fighting. He goes to his house to find his wife Andromache and their small son Astyanax. Andromache begs him not to return to the battle, reminding him that Achilles has already killed her father and 7 brothers. "Hector," she says, "you are to me father and noble mother and brother, and you are my vigorous husband. Come now, take pity, and stay here on the wall, lest you make your child an orphan and your wife a widow." Hector's response is gentle but firm. He knows she is right to fear, but he cannot hide in the city while others fight. "I know well in my heart and soul that sacred Troy will perish, and Priam and the people of Priam, of the good ash spear. But it is not so much the pain to come of the Trojans that troubles me, as troubles me the thought of you when some bronze-armoured Achaean leads you off, taking away your day of liberty in tears. This is my prayer. Let the earth be piled over my head before I hear your cry, and the knowledge of your dragging captivity." He reaches for his son, but the child, frightened by the nodding plume on his father's helmet, shrinks back, crying to his nurse. Hector and Andromache both laugh through their tears. Hector takes off the helmet and sets it on the ground, then takes his son in his arms, kisses him, and prays to Zeus that the boy will grow to be a great warrior and bring honor to his mother. Then he gives the child back to Andromache, and she takes him to her fragrant breast, smiling through her tears. Hector, moved with pity, strokes her with his hand and speaks to comfort her, though both know that there is little comfort to be had. Then he picks up his helmet with its horsehair plume and goes back to the battle. This scene shows Homer's genius. He makes us care about Hector, makes us see the humanity on the Trojan side, makes us understand that this is not a simple story of good Greeks versus bad Trojans, but a tragedy in which good people on both sides are caught up in events beyond their control. As the battles continued, various Greek heroes tried to match Hector. Diomedes had a magnificent day of battle in which he wounded both Aphrodite and Ares, gods themselves, though even he could not turn the tide. Ajax, huge and strong, held the Greeks together time and again with his stubborn defense. Odysseus, brave in battle despite his reputation being more for cunning, saved many men with his quick thinking. But the Greeks were being driven back. Zeus prevented the other gods, who largely favored Greece, from directly intervening. Battle by battle, the Trojans pushed the Greeks closer to their ships. If the Trojans could set fire to the Greek fleet, the war would be over. The Greeks would have no way to retreat or receive reinforcements. Victory for Troy seemed within reach. Agamemnon, seeing disaster looming, finally swallowed his pride. He sent envoys to Achilles, Odysseus, Ajax, and Phoenix, Achilles' old tutor, offering magnificent recompense. He would return Briseis untouched. He would give Achilles 7 cities to rule, 20 cauldrons of bronze, 7 women skilled in crafts, and the right to plunder Troy and choose his prizes before anyone else. He would even offer one of his own daughters in marriage, with a huge dowry. It was an extraordinary offer, one that should have satisfied any concern about honor. But Achilles refused. His anger had deepened beyond the original insult into something darker. He questioned the entire premise of the war. Why should he risk his life for Agamemnon, for Helen, for any of this? His mother had told him the prophecy. If he stayed home, he would live a long, peaceful life. If he fought at Troy, he would die young, but win eternal glory. At this moment, that glory seemed worthless. He would sail home, he declared. Let Agamemnon and the others face the consequences of their choices without him. The embassy returned in failure, and the Greek situation became increasingly desperate. The death of Patroclus. As the Trojans continued their advance, pushing right up to the Greek fortifications, Patroclus could no longer bear to watch. Patroclus was Achilles' dearest companion. Whether their relationship was romantic or purely fraternal has been debated since ancient times, with different cultures and eras interpreting it differently. Whatever the nature of their bond, it was profound and genuine. Patroclus went to Achilles and begged him to help. If Achilles' pride would not let him fight, would he at least let Patroclus wear his armor and lead the Myrmidons? The sight of Achilles' distinctive armor might frighten the Trojans and rally the Greeks. Achilles, moved by his friend's plea and alarmed by how close the Trojans had come to the ships, agreed. But he made Patroclus promise to only drive the Trojans back from the ships, not to pursue them all the way to Troy, or try to take the city. That glory was to be Achilles' alone, when he finally chose to win it. Patroclus donned Achilles' magnificent armor, the divine handiwork of Hephaestus, and led the Myrmidons onto the field. The effect was immediate. The Trojans, thinking Achilles had returned to battle, fell back in terror. Patroclus fought brilliantly, killing many Trojans, including Zeus's own son Sarpedon, king of Lycia and one of Troy's greatest allies. But success intoxicated Patroclus, and he forgot Achilles' warning. He pursued the Trojans all the way back toward Troy's walls. 3 times he tried to scale the walls themselves, and 3 times Apollo, protecting his favored city, threw him back. The god warned him to withdraw, but Patroclus was lost in battle fury. Apollo then intervened more directly. He struck Patroclus from behind, stunning him. The helmet fell from Patroclus's head, Achilles' helmet, which no one else should have worn. His spear shattered, his shield fell away, and the armor came loose. Suddenly vulnerable, Patroclus was wounded by a Trojan, then killed by Hector, who drove his spear into Patroclus's belly. As he died, Patroclus prophesied Hector's own doom, warning that Achilles would soon kill him. But Hector, exultant in victory, stripped Achilles' armor from the corpse and put it on himself, claiming the magnificent divine armor as a trophy. The battle over Patroclus's body was fierce and terrible. The Greeks fought desperately to recover the corpse, while the Trojans tried to seize it and mutilate it, a terrible dishonor in Bronze Age culture. Finally, Ajax and Menelaus managed to carry the body back to the Greek camp while others held off the Trojans. Antilochus, son of Nestor, was given the terrible task of telling Achilles what had happened. He found Achilles already troubled by ominous feelings. When Antilochus delivered his message, Achilles collapsed in grief so profound that his cries reached his mother Thetis in her ocean depths. The great hero who had been immovable in his anger, who had refused all bribes and entreaties, was broken by grief. He had sent his beloved companion to die in his place, wearing his own armor. His pride, his rage, his withdrawal, all had led to this moment. Patroclus was dead, and it was his fault. Thetis came to her son and found him in the dust, his face black with ashes, tearing at his hair. She knew what his grief would lead to. He would return to battle seeking vengeance, and in doing so, he would fulfill the prophecy of his early death. But she could not stop him, could only delay him briefly while she went to Hephaestus to commission new armor to replace what Hector had taken. Meanwhile, Achilles' rage, which had been directed at Agamemnon, now had a new target, Hector. And unlike his anger at Agamemnon, which had been about honor and pride, this was something more primal and implacable. This was grief transformed into wrath, the desire not just to kill, but to destroy utterly. Achilles returns. The armor that Hephaestus forged for Achilles was a wonder beyond description. Homer devotes hundreds of lines to describing the shield alone, depicting it as a cosmos in miniature. On it were cities at peace and at war, fields being ploughed and harvested, young men and women dancing, the ocean encircling all. It was armor befitting the greatest warrior who would ever live, and also, perhaps, a reminder of all that Achilles was choosing to leave behind: peace, farming, dancing, life itself. Achilles reconciled with Agamemnon, though the reconciliation was perfunctory. Achilles accepted the offered recompense without much interest. None of it mattered anymore. Briseis, Agamemnon's insult, the prizes, all were irrelevant. Only vengeance mattered now. The Greeks tried to get Achilles to eat before the battle to strengthen himself, but he refused. How could he eat when Patroclus lay dead? His mother had given him divine food, nectar and ambrosia to sustain him, but he wanted no mortal meal. Finally, he armed himself in the magnificent new armor and went to battle. The return of Achilles to the war was like the unleashing of a natural disaster. He was no longer merely a warrior, however skilled. He was a force of nature, unstoppable, pitiless, terrible. He cut through the Trojan ranks like a scythe through wheat. Men fell before him in such numbers that the river Scamander, choked with corpses, rose up in divine anger and nearly drowned him before the fire god Hephaestus drove the waters back. Achilles killed and killed and killed. When Trojans begged for mercy, offering ransom as was customary in heroic warfare, he refused them all. Before Patroclus' death, he had taken prisoners and allowed ransoms. Now he killed everyone. When Lycaon, a young Trojan prince whom Achilles had previously captured and sold into slavery, but who had returned to Troy, fell before him and begged for his life. Reminding Achilles that he had shown mercy before, Achilles' response was chilling. "Come, friend, you too must die." Why all this clamour about it? Patroclus also died, who was better by far than you are. Do you not see what a man I am, how huge, how splendid? I am son of a great father, and the mother who bore me was immortal. Yet even I have death and strong destiny waiting. There shall be a dawn or an afternoon or a noontime when some man in the fighting will take my life also. But come, don't beg me, don't entreat me. Before Patroclus came to the day of destiny, it was better for my heart to spare the Trojans. I took many alive and traded them abroad. Now not one of them shall escape death, whom the god delivers to my hands in front of Ilion. You die also, friend. Why do you cry about it? And with that, he killed Lycaon. This was Achilles in his terrible grief, no longer quite human, an instrument of death and vengeance. The Trojans fled before him in terror, streaming back towards the city. Priam ordered the gates opened to let his army retreat to safety. But one man remained outside. Hector, knowing his fate, chose to face Achilles alone. The duel of heroes. Priam and Hecuba called to Hector from the walls, begging him to come inside. The old king exposed his grey head and his aged body, pleading with his son not to face Achilles alone. Hecuba exposed her breast, reminding Hector that he had nursed there, asking him to pity her and not make her witness his death. But Hector would not retreat. He considered trying to parley with Achilles, perhaps offering to return Helen and all the treasure Paris had taken, adding more wealth besides. But he knew it was futile. Achilles would not be appeased with words. And more than that, Hector's honour demanded that he stand. He had led the Trojan assault, had killed Patroclus, had worn Achilles' armour in triumph. To retreat now would be cowardice. He had chosen his path, and he would see it through. When Achilles came around the city's corner, his bronze armour gleaming like fire, Hector's courage failed him. He ran. 3 times they circled the city, Achilles pursuing, Hector fleeing, with all the armies of Troy and Greece watching from the walls and ships. Homer compares it to a race run for a prize, but the prize was Hector's life. Zeus, watching from Olympus, wavered. Hector had always honoured him with sacrifices and prayers. Could he not save him? But Athena reminded Zeus of fate. This was Hector's destined day to die. Zeus nodded sadly and took out his golden scales, weighing the fates of Achilles and Hector. Hector's scale sank down toward death, and Apollo, who had protected him until now, abandoned him. Then Athena intervened, appearing to Hector in the form of his brother Deiphobus. Encouraged by the thought that he had support, Hector stopped running and turned to face Achilles. He proposed terms, that whoever won should respect the loser's body and return it for proper burial. But Achilles rejected even this basic civility. "Hector, I can never forgive you, as there are no trustworthy oaths between men and lions, nor wolves and lambs can have spirit in common. So there can be no oaths between you and me. Now you must pay in a lump for all the sorrows of my companions you killed in your spear's fury." They cast their spears. Hector struck Achilles' divine shield, but could not penetrate it. Hector called to Deiphobus for another spear, but Deiphobus was not there. It had been Athena in disguise, and she had vanished. Hector understood then that this was his death, that the gods had betrayed him. But he decided to die well, to win some glory even in defeat. He drew his sword and charged. Achilles studied Hector's armor, his own armor that Hector had stripped from Patroclus, looking for a weakness. There, at the throat where the collarbones separate neck from shoulder, there was a gap. As Hector came close, Achilles drove his spear through that opening. Hector fell, dying but still able to speak. He begged again for his body to be ransomed, returned to his parents. But Achilles' rage was beyond all civilized limits. "Beg me no beggings, you dog, by knees or parents. I wish only that my spirit and fury would drive me to hack your meat away and eat it raw for the things that you have done to me. No one is going to keep the dogs from your head. The dogs and the birds will have you all for their feasting." Dying, Hector made his final prophecy. "I know you well as I look upon you. I know that I could not persuade you, since indeed in your breast your heart is iron. Remember me on that day when Paris and Phoebus Apollo destroy you in the Scaean gates, for all your valour." Then death covered his eyes. But Achilles was not finished. He stripped Hector's body, and then, in an act that shocked even the battle-hardened warriors watching, he pierced Hector's feet behind the tendons and threaded leather straps through them. He'd so tied the body to his chariot and dragged it behind him in the dust, circling the walls of Troy so that Hector's parents and wife could see the desecration. For 9 days, Achilles dragged Hector's body around Patroclus's tomb. He refused to give up the corpse for burial. The body should have decomposed, been torn apart, become unrecognizable, but the gods, especially Apollo, protected it, keeping it whole despite the abuse. Still, the desecration itself was a terrible affront to gods and men alike. Priam's embassy. On Mount Olympus, the gods were divided. Some, like Hera and Athena, who hated Troy, felt Hector deserved his fate, but others were troubled by Achilles' excessive wrath. Finally, Zeus decided that Achilles had mourned long enough. He sent Thetis to tell her son to give up the body for ransom, and he sent Iris to tell Priam to go to the Greek camp with gifts and ransom his son's corpse. This was an incredibly dangerous mission. Priam was an old man who would have to go alone into the camp of his enemies, to face the man who had killed so many of his sons. But Priam's grief for Hector overcame his fear. He gathered an enormous ransom, gold, bronze cauldrons, robes, tripods, loaded it onto wagons, and set out with only a herald for company, his driver being the god Hermes in disguise, sent by Zeus to ensure safe passage. Achilles was in his shelter with Patroclus's body, refusing food, when Priam entered. The old king fell to his knees and did something that must have cost him terrible effort. He kissed the hands of Achilles, the hands that had killed so many of his sons. And then he spoke. "Remember your father, Achilles, who is of years like mine, on the threshold of sorrowful old age. Perhaps now too his neighbours are pressing hard upon him, and there is no one to defend him from the terror and ruin. Yet while he hears news that you are still alive, his heart is gladdened, and every day he hopes that he will see his beloved son returning home from Troy. But my destiny was evil. I had the noblest sons in all wide Troy, and I say that none of them is left to me. Hector, who guarded the city and its people, him you killed the other day as he fought for his fatherland. For his sake I come now to the ships of the Achaeans to win him back from you, and I bring you gifts beyond counting. Honor then the gods, Achilles, and take pity upon me, remembering your own father. Yet I am still more pitiful than he, since I have endured what no other mortal on earth ever endured. I put to my lips the hands of the man who has killed my children. This speech, this act of supreme courage and humility, finally broke through Achilles' rage. He thought of his own father Peleus, whom he would never see again. He thought of Patroclus. He thought of all the grief of this long war. And he wept, and Priam wept with him, the two men united in their shared sorrow. Achilles raised the old man up gently. He ordered his servants to wash Hector's body and anoint it, wrapping it in fine robes so that Priam would not see it in its abused state. Then he lifted the body himself and placed it in a wagon. He invited Priam to share a meal with him, and though it must have been painful for both, they ate together, honouring the ancient custom of hospitality that Paris had once violated. They looked at each other with something like understanding. "Surely you are of the gods' generation," said Priam, "for you have such beauty and stature." They spoke through the night, and Achilles promised that the Greeks would hold back their fighting for 12 days so that Troy could properly mourn and burn Hector with full honours. In the morning, Priam returned to Troy with his son's body. The mourning that followed was profound. Andromache sang her lament for her husband, thinking of the fate that awaited her and their small son. Hecuba mourned her favourite son. Even Helen wept, remembering how Hector alone in all Troy had always been kind to her, never blamed her for the war. They built a great pyre and burned Hector's body with honour. They collected his bones, placed them in a golden urn, and buried them under a mound of earth. And then, Homer tells us, they held a funeral feast. And there the Iliad ends, not with Troy's fall, not with Achilles' death, but with two enemies sharing a moment of common humanity, and with funeral rites for the greatest of Troy's heroes. It is, in many ways, the perfect ending, because the Iliad is not really about the war. It's about the human cost of war, about how anger and pride destroy not just enemies but those we love, about how even the greatest heroes are, in the end, just mortal men who will die and be mourned. But of course, the war did not end there. The Iliad is only one part of a much larger cycle of stories about Troy's fall. Thyrannus, the fall of Troy. After Hector's funeral, the war continued, and fortune favoured Troy briefly. Allies came to their aid, the Amazons led by Queen Penthesilea, and Memnon, king of Ethiopia, leading an army from the east. Both were formidable warriors, and both were killed by Achilles. The death of Penthesilea was particularly poignant in later retellings. As Achilles struck her down, their eyes met, and he saw her beauty and courage. He fell in love with her in that instant, even as she died by his hand. It was too late for anything but regret. Then came the death foretold by both Patroclus and Hector. Paris, the beautiful prince who had started it all, stood on Troy's walls with his bow. Apollo guided his arrow to the one vulnerable spot on Achilles' body, his heel, the place where his mother Thetis had held him when she dipped him in the river Styx, as an infant, trying to make him invulnerable. The arrow struck true, and Achilles fell. The greatest warrior the world had known was dead, killed not in fair combat by another hero, but by an arrow from a distance, by Paris, whom Achilles would have scorned as an unworthy opponent. Yet there is something fitting about it too. Achilles, who had dealt death to so many, died young as prophesied, but in a way that emphasized that even the greatest heroes are subject to chance, to fate, to small vulnerabilities. The Greeks and Trojans fought savagely over Achilles' body, just as they had over Patroclus's. Ajax carried the corpse while Odysseus held off the Trojans. They brought Achilles back to the camp, where the mourning was profound. Thetis emerged from the sea with her sister Nereids, and their lament echoed across the shore. They burned Achilles' body on a great pyre and placed his ashes in a golden urn together with Patroclus' bones, uniting the two companions in death as they had been united in life. After Achilles' death came a dispute that would have consequences beyond the war. Achilles' magnificent armour, crafted by Hephaestus, was to be awarded to the bravest of the Greeks. The two leading candidates were Ajax and Odysseus. When the decision went to Odysseus, Ajax was driven mad with rage and shame. In his madness, he slaughtered a flock of sheep, thinking they were his enemies. When sanity returned and he realized what he had done, he was so humiliated that he killed himself, falling on his own sword. Thus died another of Greece's greatest heroes, not in battle but by his own hand, a victim of wounded pride. Paris himself did not long survive Achilles. He was killed by Philoctetes, using the bow and poisoned arrows of Heracles, weapons that prophecy said were necessary for Greek victory. Philoctetes had been abandoned on the island of Lemnos years earlier because of a festering snake bite, but the Greeks, learning they needed him, finally brought him back to the war. With Hector, Achilles, Paris, and Ajax all dead, Troy and Greece had both lost their greatest champions. The war had dragged on for 10 years, and it seemed it might continue indefinitely. The Trojans could not be driven from their city, but neither could the Greeks be driven from their beach. Something had to change. Some new strategy had to be found. It was Odysseus, the man of many devices, who conceived the plan that would finally end the war. The wooden horse. The idea was brilliant in its deception. The Greeks would build an enormous wooden horse, hollow inside, large enough to hold a company of their best warriors. They would leave it on the beach as an offering to Athena, supposedly to ensure safe passage home. Then they would burn their camp and sail away, appearing to finally abandon the siege. But the fleet would not truly leave. Instead, the ships would hide behind the nearby island of Tenedos, waiting for the signal to return. The horse was built under the direction of Epeius, a master craftsman. Into it climbed Odysseus, Menelaus, Diomedes, Neoptolemus, Achilles' young son brought to Troy after his father's death when prophecy said he was needed. And others, sources differ on exactly who and how many. But generally somewhere between 30 and 50 warriors. Then the rest of the Greek army burned their camp and sailed away. When morning came, the Trojans saw that the Greek camp was empty, smoking ruins, and the fleet was gone. The war was over. They were victorious. They could hardly believe it. 10 years of siege, and the Greeks had simply given up and left. They poured out of the city onto the plain where so many battles had been fought. And there, standing on the beach, was the enormous wooden horse, a structure so large and magnificent that it seemed almost supernatural. Next to it was a sign saying it was an offering to Athena. The Trojans debated what to do. Some wanted to burn it, some wanted to throw it from the cliffs into the sea. Others wanted to bring it into the city as a trophy of their victory. The priest Laocoon warned against it. "I fear the Greeks even when they bring gifts," he said, and threw his spear at the horse's side. It stuck with a hollow thud, and some say that if the Trojans had listened to the sound and investigated further, they would have discovered the deception. But then the Greeks' backup plan came into play. A Greek soldier named Sinon had been left behind, allowing himself to be captured. He told a convincing story. The Greeks had intended to sacrifice him to ensure favourable winds home, but he had escaped. The horse, he said, was indeed an offering to Athena, built so large specifically so the Trojans couldn't bring it into the city, because if they did, Troy would become invincible, protected by Athena forever. Many Trojans still hesitated, but then a terrible omen occurred. Two enormous serpents rose from the sea and attacked Laocoon and his two sons, crushing them to death. The Trojans interpreted this as divine punishment for Laocoon's sacrilege in throwing a spear at Athena's offering. In reality, the serpents were sent by Athena or Poseidon to support the Greek deception, but the Trojans didn't know this. All remaining resistance collapsed. The Trojans decided to bring the horse into the city. This required dismantling part of the city wall to get it through, an act of symbolism that, in hindsight, represented Troy breaking its own defenses. They dragged the horse through the streets to the citadel, celebrating their victory with wine and feasting. Only Cassandra, Priam's daughter, cursed to speak true prophecies that no one believed, warned that the horse meant doom. She raved and cried out, but as always, no one listened to her. That night, as Troy slept off its celebration, the Greek ships returned from Tenedos, and in the silent hours before dawn, the warriors hidden in the horse's belly climbed out through a trapdoor. They opened Troy's gates from within, and the Greek army poured in. The sack of Troy. What followed was a night of horror and slaughter. Troy, which had stood unconquered for 10 years, fell in a single night of betrayal and blood. The Greeks, enraged by years of frustration and loss, showed little mercy. Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, found old King Priam at an altar where the aged king had sought sanctuary. Priam had armed himself with ancient weapons, trying futilely to defend his city one last time. Neoptolemus killed him there at the altar itself, a sacrilege that would later bring divine retribution. Priam's wife Hecuba watched her husband die, then was taken as a slave, the proud queen reduced to servitude in her old age. Hector's wife Andromache, who had begged her husband not to fight, who had feared becoming a widow and her son an orphan, her fears all came true and worse. The Greeks found her baby son, Astyanax, and threw him from the walls of Troy, killing him. The child's death was brutal but strategic. He was Hector's son, a potential rallying point for future Trojan resistance. By killing him, the Greeks ensured no heir to Hector remained. Hector's sister Cassandra was dragged from Athena's temple by Ajax the Lesser, not the great Ajax who had killed himself, but another warrior of the same name. He violated her there in the temple, a sacrilege so great that Athena herself would later destroy him for it. Cassandra was given to Agamemnon as a prize. Priam's daughter Polyxena was sacrificed on Achilles' tomb, a human offering to the dead hero's ghost. Hector's brother Deiphobus, who had married Helen after Paris's death, was killed and mutilated. Different sources tell different stories about his death. Some say Menelaus killed him in combat, others that Helen herself betrayed him to her original husband, giving Menelaus and Odysseus access to his chamber while he slept. And what of Helen herself, the woman whose abduction or elopement had started it all? When Menelaus found her, he came with sword drawn, intending to kill her for her betrayal. But when he saw her beauty again, his resolve weakened. Some sources say she deliberately exposed her breasts, using her beauty to disarm his anger. Others say she pleaded and reminded him of their former love. Either way, Menelaus could not kill her. She would return with him to Sparta, and after years of wandering, they would live together again as king and queen. The city burned. The great palaces and temples that had stood for generations were looted and set aflame. The women who weren't killed were enslaved and divided among the Greek warriors as prizes. The men were slaughtered. The gods' temples were desecrated, but Aeneas, one of Troy's princes and a son of the goddess Aphrodite, escaped. Carrying his aged father Anchises on his shoulders and leading his young son Ascanius by the hand, he fled the burning city. According to later Roman tradition, Aeneas would eventually reach Italy and become the ancestor of Rome's founders. Thus, Troy's legacy would live on and even surpass Greece in time. By morning, Troy was gone. The city that had stood proud on its hill for so long was smoking ruins. After 10 years of war, after so many deaths, after such suffering on both sides, the Greeks had won. But the cost had been terrible, and the victory would prove hollow for many. The returns. The Greek word for the journey home from Troy is nostos, from which we get our word nostalgia. But the returns of the Greek heroes were anything but sweet. The gods, angered by the Greek sacrilege in Troy, especially Ajax's violation of Cassandra in Athena's temple, and the general brutality of the sack, ensured that the journey home would be as punishing as the war had been. Agamemnon's return is perhaps the most famous, as it was dramatized by the great tragedian Aeschylus. When Agamemnon reached Mycenae, he brought Cassandra with him as his concubine. His wife Clytemnestra had waited 10 years, but she had not forgiven him for sacrificing their daughter Iphigenia. She had taken a lover, Aegisthus, and together they plotted revenge. Clytemnestra welcomed Agamemnon home with apparent joy, spread purple tapestries for him to walk on, prepared a bath. But when Agamemnon emerged from the bath, Clytemnestra threw a net over him and struck him down with an axe. She also killed Cassandra, finally ending the cursed prophetess's suffering. Agamemnon, who had survived 10 years of war and emerged victorious, was murdered in his own palace by his own wife. Menelaus, with Helen restored to him, wandered for years before finally reaching Sparta. Some say he was blown to Egypt and had various adventures there. But eventually he and Helen did return home, and according to some traditions, they lived together in relative peace. In Homer's Odyssey, which takes place years after the war, we see them hosting Odysseus's son Telemachus, appearing as a comfortable middle-aged couple. Whether Helen ever felt guilt for the war fought over her, whether she and Menelaus ever truly reconciled, the sources leave ambiguous. Diomedes returned to Argos only to find his wife had been unfaithful and had turned the city against him. He was forced to flee and eventually settled in Italy. Ajax the Lesser, who had violated Cassandra, suffered divine punishment. Athena shattered his ship with a thunderbolt. He managed to swim to a rock and might have survived, but in his arrogance he boasted that he had escaped despite the gods' anger. Poseidon, hearing this, split the rock with his trident, and Ajax drowned. Neoptolemus, Achilles' son, who had killed Priam at the altar, eventually settled in Epirus and married Andromache, Hector's widow, who had been awarded to him as a slave. This strange union, the son of the man who killed her husband marrying the woman whose baby he had murdered, speaks to the complicated aftermath of war. But the most famous return was that of Odysseus, a journey so long and adventure-filled that Homer devoted an entire epic to it, the Odyssey. Odysseus's journey would take 10 years, as long as the war itself. He would encounter the Cyclops Polyphemus, the witch Circe, the Sirens, the monsters Scylla and Charybdis would visit the land of the dead, and would lose all his companions. When he finally reached Ithaca, he found his palace overrun with suitors courting his faithful wife Penelope, who had waited 20 years for his return. With the help of his son Telemachus and the goddess Athena, Odysseus would slaughter the suitors and reclaim his kingdom. The returns collectively showed that winning the war had not brought the Greeks happiness or glory. They had destroyed Troy, but in doing so, they had incurred divine anger, lost their greatest heroes, and many found their homelands changed or unwelcoming. The war had cost everyone too much. The historical Troy. Now let us turn from myth to archaeology, from poetry to physical evidence. For while the story of the Trojan War, as Homer told it, contains gods and prophecies and events that clearly belong to legend, there was also a real city on the hill of Hisarlik in northwestern Turkey, a city that existed during the Bronze Age and that was, at various times in its long history, destroyed by warfare. The search for historical Troy is one of archaeology's most famous stories, and it centers on a man named Heinrich Schliemann. Schliemann was a German businessman who, late in life, became convinced that Homer's epics were not mere fiction, but contained a core of historical truth. In the 1870s, he began excavating at Hisarlik, a site identified by earlier scholars as a possible location for Troy. What Schliemann found amazed the world. The hill contained not one city, but many, built one on top of another over thousands of years. There were 9 major layers, later subdivided further, representing different periods of occupation from the early Bronze Age through the Roman period. Schliemann initially identified one of the lower levels, which showed signs of burning and destruction, as Homeric Troy. He found a treasure of gold objects that he romantically and incorrectly dubbed Priam's treasure. We now know that Schliemann was looking at the wrong level. The treasure he found dated to around 2500–2400 BCE, far too early to be connected with the Mycenaean Greeks or any possible historical Trojan War. The city from that period was small and relatively primitive. Later archaeological work, especially that of Wilhelm Dörpfeld and Carl Blegen, refined the understanding. The level now identified as most likely corresponding to Homeric Troy is Troy 7a, which existed around 1300 to 1190 BCE and was destroyed by violence around 1180 BCE. This timing fits with the traditional dating of the Trojan War and with the late Bronze Age collapse that ended the Mycenaean civilization. Troy 7a shows signs of hasty modifications to its fortifications, suggesting it was preparing for a siege. The level contains numerous storage jars placed throughout the city, again suggesting preparation for a prolonged siege. The destruction layer shows evidence of fire and violence. Human remains have been found in contexts suggesting sudden death. All of this is consistent with a city besieged and sacked. But Troy 7a was not the great, wealthy city of Homer's imagination. It was actually rather modest in size, with a citadel of only about 200 meters in diameter. The walls, while substantial and impressive for their time, were not the gigantic structures Homer describes. The city could not have held 50,000 inhabitants as some ancient sources claim, more likely a few thousand at most. Interestingly, the level immediately preceding Troy 7a, called Troy 6, was much more impressive. This was a larger, wealthier city with massive walls and fine architecture. It was destroyed around 1300 BCE, but apparently by an earthquake rather than warfare. Some scholars have suggested that if there was a historical kernel to the Troy legend, it might remember Troy the 6 rather than Troy the 7, or perhaps conflate the two. What can we say with confidence about the historical Troy? It existed. It was a significant settlement in the Bronze Age. It was located at a strategically important position, controlling access to the Dardanelles and overland trade routes. It had cultural connections with both the Anatolian civilizations to the east and the Mycenaean world to the west. At least one version of the city was violently destroyed at roughly the time the Greeks later claimed their war occurred. But can we say there was actually a war between Mycenaean Greeks and Troy over the abduction of a woman? No, we cannot. The archaeological evidence shows destruction, but cannot tell us who did it or why. There are no Bronze Age documents from Troy itself. No clay tablets have been found, unlike at many other Bronze Age sites. If the Trojans kept records, they were likely on perishable materials that have not survived. The Hittite archives from Anatolia are tantalizing but inconclusive. They mention a place called Wilusa in western Anatolia and a city called Tarouisa, which some scholars believe correspond to Ilios and Troia. The archives mention conflicts involving Wilusa and various Mycenaean rulers, referred to as people from Ahiyawa, possibly the Achaeans of Homer. There's even a letter about a runaway woman that some have speculatively connected to Helen's story. But none of this is definitive. The identifications are debated, and even if accepted, the Hittite documents don't describe anything like Homer's grand 10-year war. Between myth and history. So what is the Trojan War? Is it history or myth? The answer is both and neither, or perhaps something in between. There was almost certainly no war that actually proceeded as Homer described it, with gods intervening in battles, with Achilles dragging Hector's body around the walls, with a giant wooden horse allowing Greeks to sneak into the city. These are literary and mythological embellishments, the stuff of epic poetry. But there may well have been conflicts between Mycenaean Greeks and the city of Troy in the late Bronze Age. Troy's strategic location would have made it a tempting target for raids or conquest. Competition for trade routes and resources could have sparked warfare. Troy may have been sacked by Greek raiders around 1180 BCE. What Homer preserves, if he preserves anything historical at all, is not an accurate chronicle but a folk memory, a story that has been transformed through centuries of oral tradition, embellished by generations of poets, until it became the magnificent epic we have. The real events, if they occurred, would have been far more prosaic than Homer's version, probably a raid or a short campaign, not a 10-year siege. The real heroes would have been Bronze Age warlords, not the larger-than-life figures of myth. The real Helen, if she existed, was probably a noblewoman whose abduction or elopement provided a convenient pretext for a war that would have happened anyway for economic and strategic reasons. But here's the remarkable thing. Historical accuracy isn't really the point. The Trojan War matters not because it literally happened as described, but because of what it represents and what it has meant to Western culture for 3,000 years. Homer's Iliad is not a history textbook. It's a profound meditation on human nature, on the cost of war, on honor and pride and grief and rage. When Homer shows us Achilles consumed by anger, withdrawing from battle over wounded pride even as his comrades die, he's showing us how destructive ego and inflexibility can be. When he shows us Priam kissing the hands of his son's killer, he's showing us the power of empathy and shared humanity to transcend even the deepest hatred. When he shows us Hector saying goodbye to Andromache and baby Astyanax, knowing he will likely die, he's showing us the tragedy of duty and the impossible choices war forces upon us. The Trojan War story has resonated through the ages because it speaks to eternal human experiences. Love and betrayal, loyalty and honor, the costs of pride, the grief of loss, the horror and glory of warfare, the bonds of friendship, the dynamics of leadership, the relationship between fate and choice. Every generation has found new meanings in the story. Ancient Greeks saw it as the source of important ethical lessons and as the foundation myth of their culture. The Romans, through Virgil's Aeneid, reframed it to make the Trojan Aeneas their ancestor, turning defeat into future triumph. Medieval Europeans wove it into their own traditions, sometimes even claiming Trojan ancestry for their kingdoms. Renaissance writers and artists returned to classical sources and found new inspiration. Modern writers have used it to explore themes of imperialism, gender, the nature of heroism, and the psychology of violence. The story has influenced everything from Shakespeare to Hollywood movies, from ancient Greek theatre to modern novels, from philosophy to psychology. When we speak of an Achilles heel, we invoke the myth. When we warn against Trojan horses, we remember the cunning that ended the war. When we call someone a Cassandra, we reference the unheeded prophetess. The language of Troy permeates our culture. The legacy. The influence of the Trojan War on Western literature and culture cannot be overstated. It is, along with the Bible, one of the two foundational texts of Western civilization. Its impact extends far beyond literature into art, philosophy, psychology, political thought, and military strategy. In ancient Greece, Homer's epics were central to education. Every Greek schoolboy memorized passages from the Iliad and Odyssey. The stories were performed at festivals, depicted on pottery and in sculpture, referenced in plays and philosophical dialogues. The Greeks saw the Trojan War as their own history, their heroic age, the time when their ancestors performed great deeds worthy of eternal remembrance. The great Athenian tragedians Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides all wrote plays set during or after the Trojan War. Aeschylus's trilogy, the Oresteia, follows Agamemnon's disastrous return and the curse on his house. Sophocles' Ajax depicts the great warrior's madness and death. Euripides wrote multiple Troy-related plays, including Hecuba, the Trojan Women, Andromache, and Iphigenia in Aulis, often using the mythological setting to critique the violence and suffering of war in general, and specifically the Peloponnesian War, happening in his own time. The Romans, conquering the Greek world, absorbed Greek culture and made it their own. Virgil's Aeneid, written in the 1st century BCE, retold the Troy story from a Roman perspective, following Aeneas from Troy's fall through his journey to Italy. Virgil's epic both honoured Homer and created a founding myth for Rome that rivaled Greece's own. During the Middle Ages, when knowledge of Greek had largely disappeared in Western Europe, the Trojan War story survived in Latin translations and retellings. Medieval writers created new versions of the story that reflected their own values and concerns. The 12th century Roman de Troyes by Benoit de Saint-Maur introduced courtly love elements. Geoffrey Chaucer's Troilus and Crusade transformed a minor episode into a meditation on love and fate. The medieval period also saw the development of legends that various European peoples, including the Franks and Britons, were descended from Trojan refugees, giving them a noble classical ancestry. The Renaissance rediscovery of Greek texts brought renewed attention to Homer's original versions. Writers, artists, and scholars engaged with the Iliad and Odyssey directly. Christopher Marlowe wrote that Helen's face launched 1,000 ships. Shakespeare referenced the story in multiple plays and wrote Troilus and Cressida, a dark comedy that presents the war's heroes in deeply unflattering ways. In the modern era, the Trojan War has continued to fascinate. Poets like William Butler Yeats, Ezra Pound, and H.D. Hilda Doolittle have reworked Homeric material. Novelists have retold the story from various perspectives. Christa Wolf's Cassandra, Marion Zimmer Bradley's The Firebrand, Madeline Miller's The Song of Achilles, all give voice to characters Homer marginalized. Pat Barker's The Silence of the Girls tells the story from Briseis's perspective, highlighting the experience of women in war. The story has been adapted for film numerous times, from the 1956 Helen of Troy to Wolfgang Petersen's 2004 Troy. Television series, graphic novels, video games, every medium has tackled the material. Scholars have approached the story from every angle imaginable. Classical scholars study the historical and literary aspects. Archaeologists continue to excavate at Hisarlik and related sites. Anthropologists examine what Homer's world reveals about Bronze Age society. Psychologists have used characters like Achilles to explore concepts like rage and PTSD. Military historians analyze the tactics and strategy. Feminists have examined the portrayal of women and the costs war imposes on them. Post-colonial theorists have looked at the imperialism inherent in the Greek invasion. Reflections on war and humanity. Why does the Trojan War endure? What makes this ancient story, historically dubious and culturally distant from us, still compelling 3,000 years later? Part of the answer lies in Homer's genius as a storyteller. The Iliad is a masterpiece of literature with vivid characterization, powerful imagery, dramatic structure, and profound themes. It creates characters who feel real and whose struggles resonate emotionally. We care about Achilles and Hector, about Priam and Andromache, even knowing they're ancient figures from a possibly mythical war. Homer's humanity, his ability to see noble qualities in both Greeks and Trojans, to show the costs of war on all sides, transcends cultural boundaries. But I think the deeper reason is that the Trojan War speaks to fundamental aspects of human experience that haven't changed despite all our technological and social progress. War still happens. Pride still drives people to destructive choices. Leaders still sacrifice others for their ambitions. The bonds of friendship and love still matter profoundly. We still struggle with balancing duty and personal desires. We still face impossible choices where every option carries terrible costs. We still grieve for those we lose. The Iliad is, at its heart, about the human cost of war. It doesn't glorify warfare despite being set during a 10-year siege. Instead, it shows us what war does to people, how it breaks them, how it forces them into corners where honor demands actions that will haunt them, how it creates grief that echoes through generations. Consider Achilles, the supreme warrior. He is the best at what he does, unmatched in combat. But what does his excellence bring him? His prize is taken, sparking rage that leads him to withdraw from battle, a choice that gets his best friend killed. His grief drives him back to war in a fury that makes him more monster than man, desecrating Hector's corpse. And in the end, he dies young, killed by a minor warrior's lucky arrow. All his martial excellence, all his divine heritage, cannot save him from fate or from the consequences of his choices. Or think of Hector, the dutiful son and defender of Troy. He knows his cause is probably unjust. His brother brought this war upon them by violating hospitality and taking another man's wife. He knows Troy will likely fall and that he will likely die. But he cannot run away or refuse to fight without betraying everything he believes about duty and honor. So he does what he must, loves his wife and son knowing he'll probably never see them grow old, and faces his fate with courage. His virtue doesn't save him or his city. It just makes his death more tragic. The women of Troy suffer perhaps most of all. Andromache loses husband and child. Hecuba loses her sons, her husband, her city, and her freedom. Cassandra sees the doom coming but cannot prevent it or even make anyone believe her. These women are largely powerless in a story driven by male warriors and male choices, yet they bear the consequences fully. Even the winners win hollow victories. The Greeks sack Troy but incur divine wrath. Their returns are disastrous. Agamemnon survives the war only to be murdered at home. Odysseus wanders for 10 years before reaching Ithaca. Many never reach home at all. What did they really win, besides Helen, who may not have wanted to be rescued? The Trojan War shows us that in war there are no real winners, only different degrees of loss. It shows us that the heroic ideal of glory in battle is a beautiful lie that conceals the ugly reality of death and grief. It shows us that the causes we fight for are often built on shaky foundations of pride and passion, rather than justice or necessity. Yet Homer doesn't preach pacifism or suggest that warriors are simply brutal or foolish. He shows us the genuine courage and nobility that can exist even in violent contexts. Hector's farewell to his family, Achilles' reconciliation with Priam, the bonds between warriors like Achilles and Patroclus, these are real virtues and real loves, even if the circumstances that frame them are tragic. This complex, balanced view is part of why the Iliad feels so true to human experience. Homer doesn't give us simple answers or easy morals. He shows us people making the best choices they can in terrible circumstances, living by codes that both ennoble and doom them, trying to find meaning and honor in a world where gods and fate seem capricious. The archaeological quest. Let's return briefly to the physical search for Troy, because it represents something important about the human relationship to the past and to stories. Heinrich Schliemann was driven by a childhood dream, a passionate belief that Homer's Troy was real and could be found. His methods were crude by modern standards. He essentially tore through the archaeological layers, destroying much evidence in his haste to reach what he believed was Priam's city. The treasure he found he smuggled out of Turkey to Germany, where it was later seized by the Soviet Union at the end of World War II and ended up in Moscow's Pushkin Museum, where it remains today, the subject of ongoing diplomatic disputes. Schliemann was not a trained archaeologist. He was a businessman and amateur who brought more enthusiasm than expertise to his excavations. Yet he deserves credit for actually acting on his belief, for putting resources into investigating whether there was historical truth behind the myth. The work that followed Schliemann was more careful and scientific. Wilhelm Dörpfeld, Carl Blegen, and more recently Manfred Kaufmann and his successors have used modern archaeological methods to slowly reveal the complex history of the site. They've shown that Troy was continuously occupied for nearly 4,000 years, from the early Bronze Age through the Roman period. They've identified 9 major levels and numerous sub-levels. They've used ground-penetrating radar, ceramic analysis, study of botanical and faunal remains, examination of bronze metallurgy, and many other techniques to understand the site. What they've found is fascinating, quite apart from the question of Homer's war. Bronze Age Troy was at the center of complex trade networks. Pottery from Mycenaean Greece, Hittite Anatolia, Cyprus, and elsewhere has been found there. The city clearly had contact with diverse cultures. The lower town outside the citadel was larger than previously thought. Recent excavations have shown that Troy Sixian Sequia had a substantial settlement beyond the main walls, meaning the city was considerably bigger than earlier estimates suggested. Still, it wasn't the great metropolis Homer describes. It was a significant regional power, certainly, a wealthy trading city, but not a match for the greatest cities of the Mycenaean world like Mycenae or Pylos, and definitely not comparable to the major powers of the late Bronze Age like the Hittite Empire or Egypt. The archaeological quest for Troy has taught us important lessons about the relationship between myth and history. Stories can preserve kernels of historical truth, but those kernels are often buried under layers of elaboration, distortion, and invention. Archaeological evidence can confirm that places existed and events occurred, but it cannot usually tell us the specific details that make stories meaningful. The names, personalities, motivations, dialogues that give narratives their power. We know there was a Troy. We know it was destroyed by violence around when the Greeks said their war occurred. But we cannot excavate a proof that Achilles lived, or that Helen was real, or that a wooden horse entered the gates. Archaeology can provide context, and sometimes confirm, the broad outlines of tradition, but it cannot validate the specific narratives. Perhaps that's as it should be. The Trojan War's power comes from its existence in that liminal space between history and myth, where we can neither definitively prove it false, nor entirely confirm it true. It belongs to both the archaeological record and the literary imagination, and its dwelling in both realms makes it richer than if it were purely one or the other. The characters in memory. Let us consider, as we near the end of our journey, some of the key characters and what they have come to represent in Western cultural memory. Achilles embodies the heroic ideal in its most extreme form: supremely skilled, brave to the point of recklessness, driven by honor and pride. But he also shows the costs of that ideal. His rage, whether at Agamemnon or at Hector, is destructive not just to his enemies but to himself and those he loves. His choice between long life and glory represents a fundamental tension in human values. Do we seek comfort and longevity, or do we pursue excellence and meaning even at great personal cost? Achilles has become the archetype of the warrior who is both admirable and tragic, whose very virtues lead to his destruction. Hector represents duty, the defender fighting not for personal glory, but to protect his people. He is the counterbalance to Achilles, fully human where Achilles is semi-divine, fighting from obligation where Achilles fights from choice, motivated by love of family and city where Achilles is motivated by personal honor. Hector is the tragic hero who does everything right and still loses, showing that virtue alone cannot guarantee success against greater force. Odysseus is the clever survivor, the man who uses his mind as much as his strength. While Achilles represents the heroic ideal of the warrior, Odysseus represents a different kind of heroism: adaptability, cunning, perseverance. He survives where mightier warriors fall because he can think his way out of problems and is willing to use deception when necessary. This makes him a more complex figure morally. He lies, he schemes, he manipulates. But he also gets home, while more noble warriors don't. Agamemnon represents leadership tested and found wanting. He has the power and position but lacks the wisdom and flexibility to lead effectively. His inability to manage Achilles, his willingness to sacrifice his daughter, his arrogance and inflexibility, all these show how even legitimate authority can be exercised poorly. His murder by his wife demonstrates that power without justice or wisdom ultimately brings destruction. Priam is the wise old king, dignified in defeat. His journey to Achilles to ransom Hector's body is one of the most moving moments in the Iliad, an elderly man putting aside his pride and his hatred to appeal to his enemy's humanity. He represents the possibility of grace and reconciliation even in the midst of terrible conflict. Helen is perhaps the most complex figure viewed very differently in different eras. Is she a victim of divine manipulation and male desire, an object fought over by men? Or is she an agent with her own desires who made choices that she knew would have consequences? Homer gives us both possibilities, showing her both regretting the war fought over her and also adapted to her life in Troy, loved by Paris. She has become a symbol of female beauty as both gift and curse, of the woman whose sexuality gives her power and also makes her vulnerable. of the way women are often blamed for conflicts they didn't start. Andromache represents the ultimate war widow, the woman who loses everything to male violence. Her pleas to Hector to stay safe go unheeded. She loses her husband, her child, her city, her freedom, everything. Her suffering represents the innocent casualties of war, those who have no stake in the fighting but pay the highest price. Cassandra embodies the unheeded prophet, the person who sees disaster coming but cannot prevent it because no one will listen. She has become a byword for someone whose accurate warnings are ignored, usually to tragic effect. Her curse speaks to the frequent human pattern of refusing to acknowledge uncomfortable truths until it's too late. These characters have entered our collective cultural vocabulary. We still tell stories about people like them, still see these patterns play out in history and in contemporary events. The specifics change, but the underlying human dynamics remain recognizable. The end of an age. The Trojan War, whether historical or mythical, stands at a significant transition point. It represents in Greek tradition the end of the Age of Heroes, the last great gathering of the legendary warriors before the world became smaller and more mundane. The generation that fought at Troy produced no comparable successors. After them came a darker age. This mythological framework actually corresponds to a real historical transition. The Late Bronze Age, during which any historical Trojan War would have occurred, was indeed followed by a collapse. Around 1150 BCE, the great palace centers of the Mycenaean world were destroyed or abandoned. Writing disappeared from Greece. Population declined. Trade networks collapsed. The archaeological record shows a period of impoverishment and disruption that lasted for several centuries. What caused the Bronze Age collapse is still debated. Possible factors include climate change causing drought and famine, migrations of peoples, the so-called sea peoples mentioned in Egyptian records, internal rebellions against the palace elites, systems collapse where various stresses hit at once. The Trojan War, if it happened, likely occurred just before or during this collapse period. The Greeks' own tradition remembered this as a time when the sons fell short of their fathers, when the great heroes died out, when divine favor was withdrawn. They spoke of an age of heroes followed by their own diminished age. This memory, whether accurate or not, suggests a collective sense of loss, of a past that was greater and more glorious than the present. The Trojan War story, set at this transitional moment, becomes not just a story about a particular conflict, but about the end of an era. It's about the last flowering of heroism before the world changes in fundamental ways. This gives the whole narrative a sense of finality and poignancy. We're watching not just individuals die, but an entire way of life pass away. After Troy falls, after the heroes return home or fail to return, the age of heroes is over. The gods withdraw from direct intervention in human affairs. The great adventures end. The world becomes more like the one we actually inhabit, smaller, grimmer, more ambiguous. This is perhaps why the Trojan War has such enduring power. It represents not just one war, but the mythologized memory of a lost world, a time when gods walked among mortals, when heroes performed impossible deeds, when events had cosmic significance. It speaks to something in us that yearns for meaning and grandeur, even as we recognize that such things come at terrible cost. Conclusion: the eternal return. We have journeyed together through the story of the Trojan War, from the golden apple that sparked divine rivalry, through Paris's fateful choice, Helen's disputed departure, the gathering of Greek forces, 9 years of grinding siege, the wrath of Achilles, and the deaths of Patroclus and Hector, the fall of Troy through deception, and the bitter returns of the victors. We've explored both the mythological narrative and the archaeological evidence, considered the historical context and the cultural legacy. What can we conclude from this investigation of a war that may or may not have occurred 3,000 years ago? First, that stories matter independently of their literal truth. Whether the Trojan War happened exactly as Homer described it is far less important than what the story has meant to countless generations. It has given us a framework for thinking about war, honor, duty, pride, grief, and glory. It has provided archetypes and metaphors that still resonate. It has inspired art and literature and thought across 30 centuries. Second, that the best stories contain profound truths about human nature, even when they may not be literally factual. Homer's insights into psychology and ethics, his understanding of how pride and anger and grief motivate people, his recognition that enemies are still human beings who love and suffer. These truths don't depend on whether there really was a Greek warrior named Achilles. They're truths about how people behave, verified not by archaeological evidence but by their continued resonance with human experience. Third, that the line between myth and history is often blurry, and perhaps necessarily so. Stories preserve memories, but they also transform them, embellish them, give them meaning and pattern that bare facts lack. A historical event, if there was one, becomes a story, which becomes a legend, which becomes a myth, which becomes a cultural touchstone. Each transformation changes it, but also carries something forward. We cannot recover the original Trojan War, if it existed, but we can engage with what the story has become. Fourth, that war never changes in its essentials, even as its technologies and scales shift. The Trojan War speaks to modern readers because we still live in a world of conflicts, of leaders making decisions that cost other people's lives, of violence justified by abstract principles, of women and children suffering as collateral damage, of soldiers fighting and dying far from home. The bronze spears have been replaced by drones and missiles, but the fundamental human experience of warfare remains recognizable. Fifth, that stories about the past tell us as much about the times that tell them as about the times they describe. Each era that has retold the Trojan War has found in it what they needed to find. Heroic exemplars or cautionary tales, justifications for empire or critiques of violence, romance or tragedy, glory or futility. The malleability of the myth is part of its strength. The Trojan War, in all its versions and interpretations, stands as one of humanity's great stories. It has survived so long because it contains multitudes, honor and horror, glory and grief, divine and human, victory and defeat, love and hate, wisdom and folly. It refuses simple moral lessons while still being deeply meaningful. It operates on both intimate personal scales, Hector and his family, Achilles and Patroclus, and epic civilizational ones, the clash of kingdoms, the fall of cities. As we finish our exploration tonight, we might reflect on what draws us to such ancient tales. Perhaps it's because they connect us to the long chain of human experience, reminding us that people thousands of years ago asked the same questions we ask, about meaning and mortality, about what's worth fighting and dying for, about love and loss and legacy. Perhaps it's because, in a rapidly changing world, these ancient stories provide a sense of continuity and shared culture. Or perhaps it's simply that humans are storytelling creatures, and the Trojan War is one of the greatest stories ever told. The citadel on the hill at Hisarlik stands in ruins, wind blowing through the ancient stones. Tourists visit, archaeologists excavate, scholars debate. The Bronze Age is long gone. But in the realm of imagination and cultural memory, Troy still stands, still besieged, still fighting. Achilles still rages. Hector still says farewell to Andromache. Priam still pleads for his son's body. Helen still stands on the walls, beautiful and doomed. The Trojan War is over, and yet it never ends. It lives in every retelling, every interpretation, every reader who encounters Homer's verses or sees the story adapted for new media. It lives in the language we use, the allusions we make, the patterns we recognize in our own world's conflicts. So tonight, we leave Troy as the smoke clears and the ships sail, as the victors begin their troubled journeys home, as the survivors face an uncertain future. But we know we will return, because humanity always returns to Troy, always finds new meanings in its ancient stones, always hears in the clash of bronze and the cries of the dying something that speaks to our own time, our own struggles, our own understanding of what it means to be human. The wine-dark sea surrounds us. The walls of Troy rise on their hill. The heroes take up their weapons once more. The story begins again, as it always does, as it always will, as long as there are people to tell it and to listen. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of humanity's oldest and most powerful stories. May you find in it whatever meaning you need, and may the memory of Troy, whether historical or mythical, real or imagined, remind you that our stories matter, that our struggles have been faced before, and that in the end, we are all part of the long human story that stretches back to the Bronze Age and forward into an unknown future. Rest well, and remember Troy.